Order. Helen Morgan to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered the role of water companies in new housing development planning. Thank you very much, Mrs Lilbrook. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship today. Now, it's something of a cliche for a Liberal Democrat to be talking about sewage, but today I'm breaking the mould, and instead of talking about sewage in seas, lakes and rivers, I'm talking about sewage in people's homes and gardens. Now, buying a home in the UK is not easy. You spend years and years saving penny after penny, and when you finally complete and sign on the dotted line, you're both relieved and delighted. And what you are not expecting is to be forced to become an expert in complex regulations around drainage and the planning process. And most of all, you're not expecting raw sewage to start backing up into the manhole covers in your garden, in the drains, or worst case scenario, in your downstairs loo. But unfortunately, that's what some of my constituents have had to deal with when buying or living near newly built houses in North Shropshire. And I think the whole House should be asking themselves how any water company, developer, conveyancer or local authority could think that this situation was acceptable. Now, during my time as MP for North Shropshire, there have been multiple incidents where constituents have been put in the troubling position of the sewage network failing, and to be honest, I'm quite angry about the lack of progress in dealing with the issue. Just 2 weeks ago, I attended a meeting with residents from a village in my constituency. The village has seen a relatively large amount of development in recent years. It's low-lying and on a gentle slope. Severn Trent, the water company, has adopted the drainage system from the new developments there. So this is not a case where the dodgy developer has failed to build suitable infrastructure. But unfortunately, the village is an old medieval village, and the existing combined sewer infrastructure is inadequate to deal with the prolonged rainfall and the additional homes connected to it. I will give way.
Thank you. I thank my friend for giving way and also for securing this really important debate. She is talking about medieval villages. I met with residents in a little village called Mudford in my constituency last week, actually. They've got 2 new housing applications that have been recently approved, up to 1,000 homes, just further upstream on the River Yeo. Mudford already suffers from extreme flooding and relies on inadequate and fragile sewage systems that overflow already regularly during heavy rain. Worryingly, the developers plan to use the same system despite clear environmental risks. So does my honourable friend agree with me that water companies must be fully involved in the planning system to ensure that water infrastructure can handle the demand and prevent future flooding and spill of sewage?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and she's describing a situation that I think we're all familiar with. And I agree with her about the role of water companies, and I'm going to go on to that point at some length in my speech. So I thank you for that intervention. They are struggling when it rains heavily with surface water flooding and, unfortunately, with sewage backing up into homes and gardens, which I'm sure we'll all agree is pretty horrible. And there are further homes planned for that area in the planning process. And so the residents are extremely concerned because, you know, their situation is getting worse on an annual basis. An elderly female resident told me that sometimes she has to ask her neighbours not to use their bathroom because the sewage will flood into her garden if they do, at times when it's been raining heavily. And that's not a position that any homeowner should be really put in. So we need to ask ourselves for a moment how we've been allowed this to happen in the first place, because we're acutely aware of the need to build more homes. We support the government in its mission to build more homes, but it's essential that the infrastructure for both the new and existing residents keeps pace with development. Now, astonishingly, water companies are not statutory consultees when a housing development goes through the planning process. This means there's no statutory safeguard for home buyers, that the company responsible for their foul waste has ensured or confirmed that its existing sewers will cope. And indeed, there's no statutory safeguard for existing residents that a new development will not bring some unpleasant surprises.
My honourable friend, take on that point.
I will.
Thank you so much for giving way, and I thank her for securing this very important debate. So the River Watch, a local citizen scientist charity, has found that smaller pumping stations by new housing developments are seeing a sharp rise in storm overflows. More homes means more sewage, as you've so eloquently explained, and if the infrastructure can't cope, then raw sewage ends up in the River Mole. As you've mentioned, does my right honourable friend agree with me that water companies must be statutory consultees in the planning process so that sewage infrastructure is upgraded at the same time, otherwise the problem will only get worse?
Well, I thank her for her intervention, and she's exactly right, because water companies have certain powers to object to developments that exacerbate existing capacity problems, but they're very much constrained, and they're constrained by duties under the Water Industry Act in 1991. Now, the Act obligates them to accept domestic flows from new developments. And moreover, developers have an automatic right to connect to the existing network for domestic flows, which limits the ability of the water companies to object solely on the basis of network capacity. Now, they can apply something called Grampian conditions, which are a planning condition attached to a decision notice that prevents the start of the development until off-site works have been completed on land not controlled by the applicant. And they can do this through the planning authority. But they can only do that if there's already a scheme promoted, a date for the improvements to be delivered has been set, and so these Grampian conditions are rarely used. Now, my friend, the Honourable Member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale, tabled an amendment at committee stage of the Water Special Measures Bill, which would have provided some of these safeguards and ensured that water companies are statutory consultees and that the water infrastructure requirements are considered. I will give way.
Congratulate her. First of all, thank you for letting me intervene, but also congratulate her on securing a really important debate. And she talks about the amendment that we pushed at Bill Committee but was not accepted by the government. And yes, indeed, it's vital that water companies should be statutory consultees through this process, but we should also be mindful that there is an incentive for water companies to say there's no problem here. Because, of course, the additional buildings mean more water bills and more income for the water company. If they can see there's a problem, they have to, therefore, potentially, as a response, improve the infrastructure, costing them money. So isn't it right that we need to have better regulation, which is why Ofwat and the Environment Agency need to be put together to a single new clean water authority so that we enforce clean water standards on the water companies currently running rings around our regulators?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and he's campaigned endlessly and consistently on this point, and I entirely agree with him. I was concerned at the committee stage of that bill that both the government and the Conservatives voted against his amendment. So perhaps in their closing remarks they could explain the rationale to my constituents who are faced with the reality of putting cling film over their toilet every time there's a big storm. Now, the current requirements all require consultation, but they've been inadequate in this example and indeed in many others. So I would just also like to touch on the local plan process, which requires local authorities to consult with the water companies on infrastructure requirements. And that should be a positive step. That should be where the future infrastructure is determined and the plans are made by both the local authority and the water company. But many councils fail to develop local plans. Shropshire's Conservative Council has just had to withdraw an inadequate plan, having failed to satisfy the requirements of the planning inspectors, leaving the county open to a planning free-for-all in which water companies need not necessarily be consulted. So I urge the Minister to ensure that water companies are added to the list of statutory consultees in the review announced at the beginning of this week. And indeed to tighten up the rules that allow a fiasco to emerge where after years of work of taxpayers' money being spent on a local plan, it isn't fit for purpose and that whole process has to be started again. That's unacceptable for my residents paying their council tax. Now, just 10 miles north, another development has had similar issues, but in this case, in addition to concerns over the capacity of the pumping station and existing surface water flooding problems, Severn Trent has refused to adopt the drainage network, citing that the sewers haven't been built to the standard agreed by the Section 104 that had been put in place. Now, the developer, who I should add disputes that there were defects in the system, requested that Severn Trent return their Section 104 bond, and they did. All of this was done without the residents' knowledge. They only found out nearly 3 years later, following repeated complaints to the water company, which is tanking sewage away from the village on a weekly basis. So, I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And to that point about the Section 106 monies being returned to developer, this week I've had a meeting with Southern Water and then with a significant regional house builder in the south east. And we had a very similar situation presented to me there, where Southern Water hadn't actually managed to fulfil the £2 million worth of improvements to the water net, the sewage network, that had been required as part of the Section 106. Does my honourable friend agree with me that in this kind of situation, it makes it incredibly hard for politicians and councils to make the case to residents that development is justified when time and again they're let down by the development system?
Well, I thank you for your intervention, and I think that residents are genuinely concerned about the impact on their own village or town when the existing rules clearly aren't allowing for that additional infrastructure to be built. I think it's reasonable for them to expect that infrastructure to be built. And I think we would see far less NIMBYism if people could have confidence that the infrastructure was going to be there when the houses were built. I think the point I'm trying to make here is that the Section 104 process is not fit for purpose. It is ridiculous to require a financial bond. The point of it is to deal with exactly the situation where the sewage network has been inadequately built, where it needs to be adopted, and the bond is there for the water company to bring that sewage system up to standard so that it can be adopted. I will give way.
I thank her very much for giving way. I mean, as she's just said, there's lots of sewerage that is unadopted. So it was built in the 1800s by public subscription, and nobody's adopted it since. And this allows water companies, when there's a problem, to shrug and say, well, you know, search me, Gov. Does she not think that actually the government should, you know, by statute, by law, make all of these unadopted watercourses be adopted by a water company or the Environment Agency, so that there is someone that you can point to when there's a problem and say, this is your problem to solve?
Well, I think that the problem of historic sewers is particularly difficult, isn't it? Because there's no immediate developer to kind of put on the hook. But we certainly need to have a mechanism for dealing with that. And it's a complicated problem because we wouldn't want sewage from inadequate systems to start going into the main system. That's certainly the case. And it's a difficult problem for the taxpayer to have to pay for something that happened a long time ago, but we do need a mechanism to deal with it. There is no doubt about that. My homeowners in the Pines in Higher Heath are in a situation where the developer has refused to rectify the issues. Severn Trent's washed its hands clean by returning the bond. And they've got nowhere else to go. The resident told me the whole system has failed us from start to finish. He said, we've layer upon layer of water, building, planning, council, regulations, controlling authorities and processes and procedures, all designed to protect the public and the environment. Yet a pre-existing local drainage problem, a planning process, a building supervision and approval process have all failed to pick up and address it. And then the defective drains have been built, and the developer and the utility company have agreed between them to terminate the Section 104, totally wash their hands of the people who paid the taxes that fund the system that was supposed to protect the people in the first place. And is this not the root of the issue? People who rely on the regulatory system to protect them and their homes are being hopelessly let down by a system that provides no protection when the worst happens and push comes to shove. The Section 104 process clearly isn't fit for purpose, and the conveyancing process, so when solicitors are involved, seems never to detect this situation either. And I would say I have sympathy for them when the Section 104 agreement and bond have been in place, and they found that through their search. They should have reasonable confidence that the sewage network is going to be completed as planned. I've raised many times, and I won't go into all the detail again, the situation of the Brambles in Whitchurch, in which people who bought houses in that development, the developer was a rogue developer. They collapsed the company as soon as the final house was occupied. The sewage pumping system was inadequate. There was another property illegally connected to it, and 14 households spent £1 million between them fixing that situation because they were the people left holding the management company when when everything crashed down around them, and they were liable to fix that situation, and that was totally unacceptable as well. Now, local planning authorities.
Give way.
I will give way.
Thank you very much, Manager. Congratulations on calling this debate. It's an important debate. I have a couple of questions really are about, in North Bedfordshire, we have about 2.5 to 3 times national pace of housing growth. We have 2 major watercourses, River Ouse and River Ivell, going through. And the issue for the way in which section monies go with new housing development is it's always on the incremental part of a development, what it will have on the incremental impact on the network. The problem is that the overall structure needs financial support. And I'm just wondering, as she's been thinking about the point about making water companies statutory consultees, does she think that it could help with a more comprehensive understanding of the impact of any major development across a network? And second of all, that it could change the system where there's a greater demand for an escrow of funds by developers for those long-term issues that she just mentioned, rather than leaving it to individual householders.
Well, I thank him for his intervention. He makes a really good point, actually, and particularly about holding funds in escrow, I think is a very sensible suggestion. I'm reluctant to let water companies off the hook here, really, because they've made enormous profits. They have been able to predict the growth in housing and the changes in the weather and have done nothing to invest in the existing infrastructure. So let's not feel too sorry for them. But there clearly needs to be a long-term plan in place for that overall infrastructure in the area, and it needs to be taken into consideration in the planning process. I absolutely agree with him. So I was going to say local planning authorities have discretionary powers to try and prevent these situations that I've described occurring. They could stop occupation of the final properties on the development until the defective sewerage has been remediated, or they could... There are various conditions that they could put in place up front to prevent these situations occurring. But in practice, that's not happening. I will give it.
Promised residents in the Chapel Fields development in the village of St Mabon that sewage treatment would be put in place, only for families to move in and find raw sewage being collected in tankers with no proper connections and frequent sewage backup, similar to what my honourable friend has described. Does my honourable friend agree with me that water companies must be held properly accountable to ensure infrastructure is in place before the homes are built, not years later when the damage is already done?
Well, he makes a very good point, and I think that's really where we're going to with this point about them being a statutory consultee in the process, because it's no good the water companies just saying you can't build those houses. They need to be able to say, we've got this plan to improve the infrastructure and you can build those houses when we've done it. And also, we're doing it fairly quickly, I think, but it's probably quite critical as well. Just let me come back to Section 104 situation for a second, because I think one of the problems that we have is that council planning departments are very hollowed out. They have neither the human nor the financial resource to get involved in expensive planning enforcement action, or indeed to make sure that every single person has been thought about and invited to consult on a planning application in the first place. They need to be required to do it, because I think the idea that cash-strapped councils will be, going above and beyond is unlikely in the current situation, where many are desperately just trying to stave off a Section 114 situation. So we have planning legislation coming up, which is very welcome, and I implore the government to address this situation with Section 104 agreements and the bonds that secure them, because they are not at the moment the ironclad guarantees that they should be. And we need to ensure that drainage arrangements are built to an appropriate standard and adopted, so that people have the confidence that when they buy a home, they're not dealing with a raw sewage problem, for the rest of the years, and then being unable to sell their house as well in many instances. I walk away.
Thank you to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and she makes an eloquent and moving case about the impact of inadequate sewage systems on residents moving into new properties. Would she also agree that there's a need for a stronger regulatory system in relation to fresh water supply? Because in my constituency we have a water management zone which is preventing new businesses such as a brewer that I spoke to recently from expanding, and yet we also have a situation where at times of the year there's too much water and at other times there's too little. So does she agree that more effort needs to be put into strategies for water supply management for fresh water, as well as the issues she's raising?
Well, I thank him for his intervention. He raises a really good point, actually. So Shropshire is quite wet, so we don't often find ourselves talking about a lack of water. It's got to be a really, really extreme summer before we find ourselves in that situation. But he makes a really, really good point. The country is increasingly seeing very, very dry periods and then extreme rainfall in the winter. And we need to have a water system that's fit for the future that can deal with that and also deal with localised capacity issues in terms of its freshwater network as well. So I think he makes an excellent point. Finally, I'm calling on the Government to implement the recommendations of DEFRA's 2023 report on Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Act 2010. Now, this would provide a framework for the approval and adoption of drainage systems, an approving body, which is called a SAB, and national standards on the design, construction, operation and maintenance of sustainable urban drainage systems, which also have a lovely acronym, which is SUDS. Now, critically, it makes the right to connect surface water runoff to public sewers conditional upon the drainage system being approved before any construction work can start. And these are often built, currently, they're not a statutory requirement, but they're often built as a part of the planning process. And they mean that when a development is made in an area that has previously been, let's say, fields, the water must drain off at the same rate that it would have done had it still been a field. So they're a very clever way of managing surface water. And it seems odd that the government, or the previous government, and indeed the current government, haven't yet adopted Schedule 3. I think it would be an important start in protecting new and existing residents from the nightmare of both surface water and foul water flooding. So, in conclusion, Mrs Lilbuck, the current planning-led approach is clearly not fit for purpose. Numerous colleagues have turned up today to tell us similar stories of residents dealing with raw sewage in their own homes, and that's just not acceptable. The planning process is failing to protect residents of both new and existing homes, opening to the risk of surface water and foul water flooding. Most of us can't imagine how awful untreated sewage in your home must be, and a failed planning system is making that a reality for far too many people. So I urge the Minister to make water companies a statutory consultee in planning, to implement Schedule 3 to the Flood and Water Act, and to tighten the rules around Section 104 so that rogue developers can't get away with building illegal connections to the sewers. Thank you.
Just a reminder to members, if they wish to be called to speak in this debate, do please bob. The question is that this House has considered the role of water companies in new housing development planning. I'd also ask members if they could try and keep their contributions to around 4 minutes, just to make sure that everybody gets to speak who's put in to speak. Daniel Aldridge.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms Lilbuck, and congratulations to the Honourable Member for North Shropshire on securing this important debate. We are all impatient for change and proper accountability for water companies, so this is an important debate, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak on an issue that directly impacts communities like mine in Westminster Hall. Irresponsible water companies, failing regulation, red tape and suffocated local planning departments have created a perfect storm when it comes to developing the infrastructure and services we need to deliver for our communities. For too long, our local communities have been underserved by a computer, or in this case, a red tape says no approach to planning. It's astounding how many cases I've seen as an MP where sensible, well thought out and environmentally based planning applications, clearly in the public benefit, which should be easily actioned, have been held up by needless and inexplicable bureaucracy. When I speak to people in Weston, it's clear that while new housing developments bring much needed growth, however, this is not without concern that the water infrastructure, not to mention roads, health, offices, retail infrastructure, hasn't kept up pace. But hand-wringing has to stop, and I am genuinely impressed by the ambition that this government has shown in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill to make delivering for our people who are sick of delay after delay and a Britain can't get projects moving mentality. They aren't just constraints in an inbox to be managed, these are genuine concerns that affect people's daily lives. Residents feel frustrated by rapid developments without the necessary improvements to essential services like water supply, drainage, and what's really important in my constituency, re-maintenance, as it's such a fundamental part of flood prevention. My constituents are frustrated that water companies don't currently have a formal role in the planning process, so I really am supportive of this. But what I would say is that this Act is the first part of a transformation of the English water system. That the Water Special Measures Act is the first part of a transformation. And it's not the sum total of the government's ambitions. I'm sure the Minister will talk to this later. But I'm proud that this government has acted on these issues, and I was able to play an active role in the passage of the Act, which strengthens accountability. But locally, we've seen consequences of the generations of poor management. Weston's main beach, as well as Sandbay and Uphill, are all now classified as having poor bathing water quality. So the issues that my right honourable friend, or my honourable friend, talked about in her constituency, the flooding, the sewage issues, they come to the constituencies, the coastal constituencies all around the country. So we can't, these are really interlinked issues. The people of Weston and North Shropshire have always deserved so much better. And with our water and planning and infrastructure reforms, we're turning the tide on a broken system, which has left far too many with a seemingly inevitable decline in opportunities, living standards and water quality. But it is about getting the balance right, delivering the homes and services we need while ensuring our infrastructure keeps pace. I know the government is committed to this, and I'll continue to work with all concerned to make sure communities like Weston-super-Mare are not left behind by outdated attitude of red tape and bureaucracy, but also in action on critical infrastructure like our water. Thank you.
Jess Brown-Fuller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would like to also thank my honourable friend for North Shropshire for securing today's important and timely debate on an issue critically important for my constituents in Chichester and for people up and down the country. The challenges facing our water infrastructure are well documented, and across the country, wastewater treatment works have been operating well beyond their capacity for years with serious consequences, and I'm minded to remember a situation back in the general election where I knocked on the door of a lady I hadn't seen in many years. Her name is Alison. She lives in my constituency. She's a wheelchair user, and she told me how she'd been moved to a new social home. She was delighted. She'd lived there happily for 2.5 years until a new development was built just in the field next door, and suddenly her toilets no longer flushed and she had no access to her wet room. When she spoke to her water company about sewage rising up in her toilet, she was recommended to go to the local pub and use their facilities. It's totally unacceptable for Alison and for every single constituent that is facing these situations, because when our systems become overwhelmed, storm overflows and sewage spills then pollute our rivers, harbours and coastline, failures that are visible nationwide. Water companies have a duty not only to provide clean water, but also to manage wastewater safely and effectively, and yet the system has been failing for many years. In my constituency of Chichester alone, there were 990 recorded sewage spills last year, which lasted over 17,000 hours. These happily give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I have to say, I slightly regret asking you to give way at this particular moment, because you've just mentioned 17,000 hours of sewage, and as a result of a recent Freedom of Information request to Thames Water related to my constituency, they had to reveal to me that they have released sewage into Surrey Heath rivers for 543 hours since the general election on the 4th of July, slightly more modest numbers by comparison to 17,000 hours that your constituents have faced, but nonetheless hugely significant given that we only have 4 sewage outlets in the whole of my constituency. Does my honourable friend agree with me that if we want new housing to be built, and we do, then water companies, who we are often very hard upon, need to be treated as strategic partners in development, and to be forced also with tougher regulation, admittedly, in order to deliver the rapidly growing communities that we want to have for all of our residents? Thank you.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. He's absolutely right that we are tough on water companies, and so we should be, because, as the honourable member for North Shropshire said, they've made large amounts of profits and they have a duty to make sure that every single constituent in this country has access to clean and safe water and that it's disposed of appropriately. But I absolutely agree that they should also be included as a strategic partner, and I will come on to that in my contribution, because these failures harm our environment, they endanger public health, and they threaten local economies, particularly tourism, which relies on clean water and a thriving natural landscape. So in the government's plan for change, they've set out an ambitious proposal to build 1.5 million homes in England and accelerate planning decisions. So while there is no doubt that new homes are needed, they must be accompanied by the appropriate infrastructure to support them. And water companies have a duty to maintain, improve and extend their water supply networks to account for future water needs, but they are currently excluded from the planning process by not being listed as a statutory consultee. This omission means that when a development is proposed for a site where there is no capacity, water companies lack the opportunity to formally object or insist on necessary infrastructure improvements before the permission is granted. This issue is compounded by how capacity is currently measured in our wastewater treatment plants, because instead of assessing the real-world resilience of our wastewater infrastructure, capacity is gauged by measuring dry spells over a 12-month period, which means that a company's capacity can change year on year depending on the weather, and with an ever-changing climate, that is not an accurate measure of a site and the capacity that it can cope with. It's not a realistic reflection of the demand on new developments in place. If they were statutory consultees, they could highlight those inefficiencies at an earlier stage, ensuring that essential upgrades are planned and delivered before new improvements and developments are approved. And in Chichester, we are currently dealing with the absence of a proactive water management system, with the lack of capacity at a specific wastewater treatment works in Appledram, which is delaying the regeneration that the city centre so desperately needs. So in order to address these challenges, we must adopt a more proactive and consistent approach to wastewater management. And as the member for North Shropshire mentioned, a key element to this is sustainable urban drainage solutions, otherwise known as SUDS. And I'm really pleased that Chichester District Council have included SUDS as part of their local plan, which is currently being inspected upon. But that shouldn't be applied on an authority-by-authority basis. We should see legislation that means that SUDS are the standard across the country. Thank you.
David Reid.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship today. And I thank the honourable member for North Shropshire for bringing this important issue forward for us to debate. An issue that I hope we can find cross-party consensus on to bring about the meaningful and effective change that we and our constituents want badly to see within the water industry. I wish to start with a case study from my constituency, Exmouth and Exeter East, which illustrates the problematic nature of the current planning framework in relation to how water companies operate. Cranbrook is a rapidly growing new town in East Devon. In the 2021 census, Cranbrook recorded just 6,700 people. However, the local council is proposing to grow the town to 8,000 homes, which will accommodate around 20,000 people. A dedicated sewage pumping station to treat waste locally and prevent overloading existing infrastructure was promised by our local water company, South West Water, during the planning phase for the town. However, South West Water have since scrapped the proposed pumping station and instead redirect Cranbrook's existing waste 6 miles away to the Countess Weir sewage treatment work in Exeter. Now, Countess Weir is already under pressure and suffers from regular sewage spills into our beautiful River Exe. With Cranbrook's projected growth rates, it doesn't take big brains to work out that this current plan is unsustainable at best and dangerous at worst. Now, if local politicians and pressure groups had known at the time that South West Water were not going to make good on their promise and weren't going to be held accountable for not doing so, I should imagine that objections to the town being built would have been more persistent and more loudly heard. As we all know, this Labour government has committed to building 1.5 million new homes this Parliament, yet as to date, they have not adequately explained how they will ensure infrastructure will keep pace with development. With multiple proposals for new housing in my constituency and a new town in addition to Cranbrook, I fear the same avoidable mistake will happen twice to my home. Now, for the record, I'm not against house building, but I am against house building that is delivered without the corresponding infrastructure. The issue of water infrastructure planning is one that has long been overlooked, and yet it is crucial to ensuring that new housing developments do not lead to avoidable environmental and public health disasters. As we've heard, currently water companies are not statutory consultees in the planning process. Their role is limited to local plan development, which means they often engage far too late once planning applications are well underway. This lack of early involvement leads to delays, uncoordinated infrastructure, and ultimately a failure of accountability when things go wrong. To offset against this flaw in planning law, local councils have resorted to using other mechanisms to force compliant behaviours from water companies. We've heard about Grampian conditions, and these are designed to prevent development from proceeding until certain infrastructure requirements are met. However, they do not force water companies to deliver the necessary infrastructure. If a water company delays investment, a development can be stalled indefinitely, or worse, proceed without proper infrastructure, leading to sewage overflows and environmental damage. Again, we've heard about Section 106 agreements, which are legally binding agreements requiring developers to fund infrastructure projects. However, again, water companies are not legally required to use these funds for local improvements, meaning that money intended for vital infrastructure could be diverted elsewhere. Lastly, yeah, of course.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, for allowing me to speak. So what we have is water companies have a responsibility with regards to the community they're in and the developments that they play a part in. So I'm keen to hear from the Minister to outline what the Labour government reforms will do to encourage water companies to be front and centre in regards to plan making and infrastructure build. Thank you.
I thank the honourable member for that, and I too want to hear from the Minister what plans he has to make sure that infrastructure keeps pace with development. So going back to SIL, so Community Infrastructure Levy is another funding mechanism, but SIL revenue is stretched across multiple infrastructure needs, and not all funds go towards water and sewage system. The local plans allow for local councils like mine, East Devon District Council, to set policies ensuring sustainable development. However, these policies depend on voluntary cooperation from water companies and developers. If a water company refuses to engage early, the council lacks the full picture when making planning decisions. Developers can also challenge infrastructure requirements if they increase costs, leading to weak enforcement. Now, given these issues, I argue, as with other members here today, that water companies must become statutory consultees in planning applications. This would mean that developments could not proceed unless water companies confirm that infrastructure is in place to support them. The case that I raised about Cranbrook in my home has demonstrated the consequences of failing to integrate water infrastructure planning with house building. If we do nothing, we will see similar issues arise across the country, with more communities left to suffer the consequences of inadequate water and sewage systems. Thank you, Chair.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Littlebuck, and it is an honour to serve with you in the chair. And I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for North Shropshire, for bringing about a debate not just about housing developments, but also sewage too. Clearly matters that are important to 13 Liberal Democrat MPs who've been present in this debate this afternoon, but frankly, all 72 of us. And also, I'm pleased to follow my neighbour, the honourable friend, the honourable member for Exmouth and Exeter East, who I do regard as a friend on this issue, because we have the same sea, and it has been dogged by sewage pollution from the same water company. So we cooperate very well on this issue. When my honourable friend for North Shropshire talks about sewage backed up in people's home, I recognise that because I had a surgery about 6 weeks ago in the village of Fennerton, and some people came to see me who showed me photos of sewage in the leat, in the stream at the end of their garden, with very visible, I mean, when you see toilet paper and condoms, you've got a pretty good idea that this isn't naturally occurring sewage. And the story that they told is, again, one of neighbours having to go and knock on the doors of people in their street to ask that flushes are not pulled, that baths are not emptied at a time of heavy rain, for fear that the sewage backs up into people's private homes. And this is indeed something that water companies and ministers have told us about for a while, that when seeking to excuse the volume of sewage that is spilled, we're sometimes told that it's a simple choice between either having sewage backing up into people's homes or it being emptied out into our rivers and seas. And I think the purpose of this debate is that it's not actually a straightforward binary choice. There are other ways. Yeah. In this week, the week that the government is removing as statutory consultees on planning Sport England, the Theatres Trust and the Gardens Trust, I'm hoping to hear from the government that it is doing this to make way for water companies. To again use my example of Fennerton, this is a village that has been subject to flooding over a very long period of time, and it's very well recognised by both councils and the water company, such that East Devon District Council has spent £6 million of taxpayers' money to introduce a flood alleviation scheme into the village. And that's taxpayers' money that wouldn't have been necessary had there been good advice right at the outset from water companies when planners were proposing to build in that area. I also point to Ackland Park in Fennerton in particular, where residents have been left to try to get their sewer adopted by the water company themselves because of a developer that has gone bust. Again, had the water company been consulted at the planning stage, this may not have come about. Now, we've heard about water companies objecting somehow to being statutory consultees. That's not my experience. I met with the Chief Executive of South West Water in recent months. Now, I've been a thorn in the side of South West Water. If we're having a competition this afternoon about volume of sewage spilled, I think I can win it with over 500,000 hours of sewage spills in 2023 in the South West region. I confess not the constituency I represent alone, but the South West region is absolutely dogged by sewage spills. There was an 83% increase in sewage from 2022 to 23. And the Chief Exec of South West Water asked me to lobby the government to have water companies as a statutory consultee. I do that not because I'm being lobbied, I do it because it's in the interests of the residents who I represent. And I'd be curious to know from the Minister whether he too has been asked by water companies, whether he and his colleagues have been asked if water companies could be statutory consultees. Thank you.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A real pleasure to serve under your chairship. And first of all, can I thank the Honourable Lady for North Shropshire for leading today's debate. I was just saying to the Honourable Lady beforehand, it's been a while since we've been in Westminster Hall together. We renewed that acquaintance once again, and I congratulate the Honourable Lady on bringing it forward. Housing development in Northern Ireland is a completely different ball game. The Minister will know this. The Minister hasn't the answer to any of my queries because it's not his responsibility. The system is very different. The debate gives us an opportunity to participate, and for my case, I very much, first of all, welcome the Labour government's commitment to the 1.5 million houses. I think it does regenerate the economy potentially. It gives jobs, it gives development, it gives people opportunity as well, and I think it's the right thing to do. But what we do need to have within that, of course, is enough skilled workmen to be able to do that job. And just to give a local perspective on Northern Ireland, if I can, the Northern Ireland Water Infrastructure for new housing developments is managed by Northern Ireland Water. That's a government body, by the way. I think some people here may say, well, if that's the way it is, at least that way you only deal with one person and it all gets done. And our system is quite simple. My office deals with lots of, indeed numerous issues each week under the responsibility of NI Water. And I have to say I'm glad to have a good working relationship with them. We do complain now and again. We find that their reaction to our complaints are positive, and they do their best to try and do that. When I hear of the 500,000 hours that the gentleman referred to in the South West region, it gives me goose pimples just to think about it and what that means. And in addition to this as well, we also have dozens of fantastic developers looking to expand and enhance the property scene across Northern Ireland, who will have to work closely alongside Northern Ireland Water in relation to decent infrastructure, which is really, really critical to the factor. In many cases, network reinforcement and new infrastructure is needed, and that can be very costly, and of course, but also necessary for new and improved housing developments. On one other issue that is pivotal, Madam Chair, is that we have witnessed over the last couple of years. You always talk about the flooding the 100-year flooding, and it only happens, but now 100-year flooding now happens about every 2 to 3 years, and it's become now a norm rather than an exception. So therefore, you have to look at at what I think the Honourable Lady here referred to, looking at the future and what the stats provide for what needs to be done. So I've dealt with many flooding issues in my constituency. It's important that these provisions are taken into consideration in terms of water supply and drainage at new housing developments. There are also many environmental regulations that developers must comply with, and these come from the Northern Ireland Environmental Agency, specifically in relation to water pollution and the sustainable drainage. I remember the developments of years ago. I'm old enough to remember things not too far back where the sewage system and the storm drain water all went into the same system. Not today, nor should it today either, because you can't. The capacity isn't there to take it all. But it did happen in the past. So we need to ensure good communication and good working relationships with government and non-governmental agencies. From planning to environmental, water companies to developers, Northern Ireland Water and water companies are obligated to supply water connections to all residential properties. But there has to be a good engagement. So I am happy to say, if I can say in this debate, that Northern Ireland Water in Northern Ireland have a good capacity and a good relationship with elected representatives. Developers have a working relationship that they need with Northern Ireland Water to make it work. And if there's occasions whenever the sewage system is unable to take a development of, say, 100 houses, then the developer must take it upon himself or herself to provide for those 100 houses a system whereby the sewage can be taken away either by lorry or whatever. There are systems, and I know it's not the things that maybe that the Minister can answer to, but I think some of the things we do in Northern Ireland, and indeed having Northern Ireland Water as a governmental body, may just be the other answer. I'm not a socialist, by the way, just for the record, but I say this, there are things that are right. Doesn't matter whether they come from a socialist policy or another policy. If they're right, I just suggest maybe very gently to everyone in this chamber, maybe all those water companies need to have a new boss.
Vicky Slade.
It is a pleasure to serve under your chair, Mr. Lilbrook, and thank you so much for my honourable member for North Shropshire for bringing this important debate. It was deeply disappointing to hear this week about the bodies being removed, and I completely agree with my honourable friend from Honiton and Sidmouth that while we're taking away the rights for people like Sport England, which I think is deeply regrettable, I hope too that it is to make space for the water companies, because it's something which we have been calling for a long time, that they should be a statutory consultee. Whilst they have a statutory duty to connect all new homes to the sewage system, it seems quite ridiculous that nobody seems to be able to speak up, and apart from us here, but in our communities, to say there is no capacity left in the system. And if water companies are not allowed to say no, how can we actually make sure there is enough space? I've been working with the local water company, Wessex Water, and a fantastic campaigner, Bill Burridge, to deal with a problem in the village of Merley. The community was built predominantly in the 70s and 80s, and their sewage system was already at bursting point, literally. Most of them were built at a time when the surface water was allowed to go into the sewage system, and as a result, whenever it rains, a brown sludge washes across the Stour Valley Way, which is a well-used leisure route, and directly into the nature park and the River Stour, exactly where the local rowing club go and the Wimborne Angling Club fish. It is beyond ridiculous that the location is, you can see the two side by side. 600 new homes are about to be built there, between the current homes and the river, which increases the capacity by 25% of that community. And whilst there are some Section 106 obligations in place, there appears to be little enforcement, because we had to tell the sewage company that some of the houses were already occupied for them to say, oh, we'll get the project team down there to see whether things need to be upgraded. It really was quite laughable. So if the government is serious about getting homes for people occupied, their water companies need to be required to act before the homes are ready to go, so that we're not ending up with a situation where homes are waiting for connections and sewage systems to be upgraded. But there is another problem which affects not only people who are moving into new homes, but for the people already living there. And that is that we are finding that the
as water companies are being forced to repair the sewers and reduce the spills, the surface water that has been flowing for often decades through those systems is now backing up in people's gardens. And there is nowhere for it to go. The houses have been long ago built, the concrete has been laid, and there is absolutely nowhere for all of this excess water to go. Water from the ground, water from the surface. Homes in Broadstone, including in the Springdale area, are finding their gardens unusable, and houses that are slightly further down the hill are using sandbags to prevent the water flooding into their homes and gardens, despite them being around 5 miles away from the nearest river. And yet the water companies are saying it's not their problem, because they're fixing their drains, they're fixing their sewers. The councils are saying it's not their problem because it's not public land. Whose responsibility is it? We can't expect homeowners to suddenly be faced with gardens that are underwater. And other homes in Broadstone, as like my friend in North Shropshire, have also seen sewage bubbling up, sometimes in their living rooms. And the only reason we've been given by the water companies for this is that they are the oldest homes in the area, they're closer to the water treatment plant, and therefore all the new homes are being connected and they're having to face the consequences of inadequate systems. The water companies have absolutely no answer to this. Individual homeowners are being expected to put up with it, and the only investment that's going in is where the new homes are. So my ask to the Minister is, what are you doing to make sure that the water companies and the developers are providing for the homes that are already in a community? Thank you.
Edward Morello.
Thank you, Mrs. Lilbuck. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for North Shropshire, for securing this very important debate. For too long, our rivers and streams and seas have been treated as a dumping ground for sewage, with water companies failing to maintain and invest in the infrastructure necessary to protect our natural environment. This has a devastating effect on local residents, businesses and tourists who rely on clean water and unspoiled landscapes. It's clear that the current system is failing and urgent action is required. That is why we must make water companies statutory consultees in the planning process for all new housing developments. At present, water companies are not required to be consulted when new housing projects are proposed. It's merely best practice. This is a glaring omission, considering the wastewater and sewage from new developments will inevitably place further strain on an already struggling system. The consequence for this failure can be seen across the country, including in my own constituency of West Dorset, where the issue of sewage pollution has reached crisis levels. In 2023 alone, West Dorset experienced over 4,100 sewage spills from storm overflows. And out of the 500,000 hours my honourable friend and neighbour mentioned the South West has suffered, our beaches and rivers suffered 45,000 hours of sewage discharge from existing degraded sewages and water systems, tarnishing the very landscape that makes my region so special. The River Lim, which flows into Lyme Regis, was declared ecologically dead due to the severe pollution it has suffered, something we're only aware of due to the efforts of the citizen scientists of the River Lim Action Group. Yeah. This is a state of affairs that is simply unacceptable. West Dorset is part of the Poole catchment area, where an excess of nitrogen has had a disastrous effect, with significant reductions in biodiversity. Without proper infrastructure, any new homes built in the catchment area are only going to add to the pollution burden. We must ensure that the impact of wastewater of new developments is properly managed. The government's nutrient migration scheme is a step in the right direction, but it cannot be the only answer. Water companies must be consulted from the outset to ensure that sustainable infrastructure is in place before new homes are built. Without this, we risk compounding an already dire situation. The Minister for State for Housing and Planning issued a written statement on the 10th of March 2025 regarding the reform of the statutory consultative system. This provides an opportunity to review the role of water companies in the planning system. If the government is serious about tackling the sewage crisis, they must seize this opportunity and ensure that water companies are statutory consultees without delay. It's not just about the environment, it's also about our local economy. Tourism is a vital industry for West Dorset. Visitors come to enjoy our beautiful beaches and waterways. It is unacceptable that residents and tourists must check pollution alerts before we can swim. If we do not act now, the economic consequences on my area will be severe, with local businesses and communities bearing the brunt. We need real accountability and meaningful change. Making water companies statutory consultees will help ensure that new housing developments do not further damage an already failing system. It will bring transparency to the planning process, force water companies to take responsibility for the new infrastructure planning that is essential for our environment, our economy and for the public health.
Ollie Glover.
Thank you, Mrs. Lewis-Buck. It is truly a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I join colleagues in commending my honourable friend, the member for North Shropshire, for securing time to discuss this vitally important issue, which I feel is a symptom of a wider malaise of our planning system, as I shall go on to explain. But first, regrettably, I have to add my local examples of this problem to the many others that we have already heard. In Didcot, during the early stages of the building of Great Western Park in 2014, there were major sewage issues, so much so that tankers had to be brought in to deal with the sewage created by the new homes, and before long, temporary tanks were installed. There was simply not enough capacity in the local system delivered before the significant housing growth. And of course, as colleagues have said, this was accompanied by all the usual extremely circular and tedious arguments about whose fault it all was and where responsibility for sorting it out lies. And I'm sure all honourable members can agree that our residents are not particularly interested on whose fault it was. They just want these things sorted out now and for the future. In the village of East Hannay, in the new street and houses of Anderson Place, a pump station and sewage system was not constructed to a standard that was acceptable to Thames Water for adoption, even though the approved plans listed the infrastructure as quote-unquote proposed adoptable. In the village of East Challow, on the Childry Park estate, the council has been unable to adopt the drainage, and residents are currently in a state of limbo. There was a Section 104 application submitted, but everyone's unsure if this means that the infrastructure has been adopted. Thames Water says that adoptions are not a short process and they have a high standard of inspection before they adopt, so they're unable to commit to a timescale. Meanwhile, local planning enforcement, as we have heard during this debate, are struggling as to how to deal with sewage systems which are not fit for adoption by water companies. And developments are being built with drainage and sewage systems that the water company refuses to adopt, and in any case, they're not capable of being adopted without expensive remedial work. The Liberal Democrats want to ensure all new development is accompanied by the necessary infrastructure to support it. So given the missed opportunity of the water bill, I call on the government to ensure that provision is made in upcoming legislation to ensure that providers of essential infrastructure are held to account. And we will continue to challenge those water companies to stop sewage spills, but also holding developers to account so that infrastructure for good water management is built with new developments. This all reflects a wider problem with our planning system. We certainly do need houses. However, central government enthusiasm for housing targets is not generally matched by as much passion for ensuring and measuring that infrastructure and key public services are improved alongside. Mrs. Lewis-Buck, I approach my final point with some trepidation. I have already established something of a reputation as a geek amongst my honourable friends in this House. But I will take the risk. I will take the risk and continue. I will confess to being a fan of the 2015 computer game Cities Skylines. And if the Minister has not yet had the pleasure of playing that game, then perhaps it is something he could request as an early Christmas gift. The game is all about planning and building cities, and it teaches us much about effective planning. Insufficient sewage and wastewater capacity leads to fewer people moving in, as well as reduced tax revenues. And the game elegantly demonstrates how a predict and provide approach is far better than reactive chaos. I hope the Minister will tell us how the government plans to move the real world in that direction.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis-Buck. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and I'd like to congratulate also my honourable friend for securing this debate and for her tireless work, which I have seen for myself in North Shropshire. Can I start by saying it's a particularly timely debate with the first reading of the government's Planning and Infrastructure Bill earlier this week. As Liberal Democrats, we want to see more housing built, but in particular we want to see a target of 150,000 homes for social rent per year, and we urge the government to set such a target. We also need a new generation of rent-to-own housing for a generation for whom the housing ladder has risen out of reach. However, as the government pushes for its 1.5 million homes target. The way to get Britain building is to deliver the infrastructure, the GPs, the schools, the bus routes, and the water and sustainable drainage infrastructure that communities want to see. And the best way to do that is to ensure that local people are at the heart of those decisions about how their towns, villages and neighbourhoods should take shape and develop. And water infrastructure is one of the most challenging to get right, not least because of the dire strait of the existing infrastructure after years of underinvestment as private companies have siphoned off funds, often to overseas shareholders and in bonuses under the previous Conservative government. Outflows of money thrown into even sharper relief given increasingly unpredictable rainfalls and weather patterns due to climate change, which should become more frequent and intense as a result. Fixing this issue is therefore important not just for new home buyers, but for the lives of everyone in communities up and down the country who increasingly face the risk of the disastrous consequences we've heard about. Risks that many of my Taunton and Wellington constituents know only too well. In Rushden, for example, children are frequently unable to reach their local secondary school due to flooding in Light Lane, the only road that leads to it from the village. And Rushden is now facing a lot more development that could make things worse. Young people in Creech St Michael face the same problem. Meanwhile, at Hook Bridge, at Stoke St Gregory, the River Tone surging across the floodplain to... I will give way.
Thank you. I appreciate the honourable member giving way. I think one of the things that his constituency and my constituency share is that we're quite close to floodplains, and it's the marine management that has been a real problem, and that does go back to the austerity cuts of the coalition government, and we still have not got back from that. That is a real problem for many, many coastal communities, and I think that's something that should unite us in getting us back to a position where marine management in our communities is back to the position where our housing can be delivered sustainably.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. He's absolutely right. We need more investment in this area, which is why the Liberal Democrat manifesto was the only manifesto to identify the additional funding that the Environment Agency needed for flood defence work and indeed Natural England needed. Indeed, also, similarly to the other villages I mentioned, and he mentions the floodplain, a large part of my constituency is in the floodplain, and when the river surges across that floodplain, it far too often carries sewage with it from the sewage works right across a vast area in ways that's totally unacceptable. And no one should have to deal with that raw sewage coming into their homes and their gardens. So my honourable friend for North Shropshire and my honourable friend for Chichester are absolutely right that Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act needs to be commenced. The schedule would require approval of drainage and sustainable drainage systems, SUDs, as we've heard, to be provided in all but the most exceptional cases. And it would establish a proper authority for their regulation, ensure they're properly designed and maintained. It's not right that the burden of poorly constructed drainage systems should fall on individuals who have saved for years to get their first home because of inadequate regulation and safeguards. Alongside Schedule 3, we should have proper planning enforcement. Too often the Cinderella service of planning, as my honourable friend for Didcot and Wantage has mentioned. In fact, planning departments recover nothing like the full cost of planning services from applicants due to the cap placed on them by central government for decades. And council taxpayers are therefore subsidising those developers. My honourable friend, the member for St Albans and Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, was absolutely right in November 2023 to introduce a bill to remove that cap on planning fees. And we're delighted to see in the bill published this week that campaign for full cost recovery has finally won the day. It looks like it has in any event. But without proper enforcement of sustainable drainage, there's a very real risk that the drive to increase housing numbers will increase this problem. And having worked with Sir Michael Pitt in a past life, I looked up last night his report on the 2007 floods and exactly what happened to his 2008 recommendation that Schedule 3 should then be commenced. Well, by 2014, Mr Lilbuck, the government had consulted on the necessary guidance, was on track for completion of commencement before 2015. But I'm sad to say that in 2015, Mrs Lilbuck, the trail goes very cold. We had to wait until 2023 when the government, Conservative government, said in its document that the review... the review of the implementation of Schedule 3, that the government had instead decided to rely simply on policy. And in fact, the 23 government review concludes that its approach, in using technical language, is not working. And went on in more technical language to say non-statutory technical standards for sustainable drainage systems should be made statutory. As the current ambiguity of the role of planning authorities is very difficult. The review also found that in general there were no specific checking regimes in place to ensure sustainable drainage had been constructed as agreed, leading concerns about unsatisfactory standards of design and construction and difficulties of ensuring proper maintenance once the developer has left the site. If only, Mrs Lawbuck, they had followed the advice of the PIT review and commenced Schedule 3 back in 2015, maybe many of the people we've heard about would not have had the same problems. In the past, there's been a body of law to control drainage into traditional sewers, in the words of the Act, communicating with the public sewer. But relatively new SUDs don't have the same body of regulation. There's therefore really no longer any reason why that shouldn't be commenced as soon as possible, if not immediately. It shouldn't take another flood to make that happen. Similarly, water companies as statutory consultees is an excellent suggestion, as my honourable friends from across the country have pointed out. I'm not sure why that can't be enacted. In conclusion, Mrs Lilbuck, it's time to implement the recommendation of the PIT review of 2008, the government's consultation on the response to 2014, DEFRA's 2023 review, which I just quoted, and implement, finally, Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act, before communicating with the public sewer becomes something that our constituents are forced to do in an all too upfront and personal way in their own homes and gardens. Thank you.
Opposition spokesperson, Paul Holmes.
Thank you very much, Mrs Lilbuck, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I congratulate the Honourable Lady, the member for North Shropshire, who made a speech about some issues that we can all share our concern on in this House. As being constituency MPs, we often go through the same casework. I am also aware that there are issues in my constituency along the issues that she has described, and her debate today is particularly timely. And can I also congratulate the Lib Dem spokesman on charming revisionism of his party's record in government. But I'll tackle some of the comments that have been made by some of the contributors in this debate, and then some general remarks about where we are in policy terms at the moment under this government. And the Honourable Lady who proposed the debate has raised the hell about a genuine hell from constituents who often find that who live in homes that have been built many years ago but are now surrounded by a housing development that has not been properly connected to sewer systems or to drainage systems. And that's a particular issue in old villages. In fact, in my constituency in Botley, we've got the Botley-Curbridge corridor, where we've seen around 3,000 houses being built. And in sections of that Borley Green development, we now have a housing estate that cannot be used because the water company, but the developers have not put adequate infrastructure in, and those houses cannot be sold because out of the drainage systems we've got backed up sewage. And I understand the frustration that she's been going through in trying as an office and as a Member of Parliament to make sure that she can go to the right organisation or the right channels of communication to try and get those things sorted. I've also gone through that, and I know how challenging that is. I would also say that she mentioned in her remarks, and this is not a criticism of her at all, genuinely, that a number of the contributions this afternoon have targeted water companies for not doing enough. And I agree with that, but I also think there are examples that have happened in my constituency and across the country where water companies have genuinely tried to raise the alert about some of the frustrations they may have in building the infrastructure or saying that they are concerned about a development. One example is a large-scale development in my old constituency of Eastleigh, which borders my new constituency, One Horton Heath, where quite clearly more water companies have said that the land that this is being built on and the situation where this development is going, they are very worried about some of the powers that they want to put forward and some of the infrastructure they want to be put forward but have not been listened to in the planning system. Very briefly on some other contributions, the Honourable Lady for
Cheltenham is a local hero in my constituency. Not Cheltenham, sorry, Chichester is a local hero in my constituency because I know that she has a history of speaking on issues like this. I hope she doesn't become too much of a hero in the northern villages of my constituency. But she will know that we are sharing some infrastructure investment that is going on from Southern Water and Portsmouth Water with the Water for Life scheme. I, like her, have serious concerns about some of the transparency and some of the plans going forward. She was absolutely right to mention some of the infrastructure that will be built to try and deal with the overall issue that the Honourable Lady from North Shropshire has described. But I remain concerned that this is a lot of money for a short-term project without a company like Southern Water, who has shown, quite frankly, they can't manage to run a bath properly. Making sure that they manage this project properly is something that I share deeply with her, and I hope that we can work together going forward to ensure that that project is fully looked at. And my honourable and gallant friend from Exmouth and Exeter East mentioned a large-scale development in his village of Cranbrook that's being expanded, and that water company, the South West Water, have not made good on the promise that they made. He made a generally interesting point about the 1.5 million homes. He is clear that the government needs to be clearer on reform. I'm hoping that as we go through the parliamentary stages of the planning and infrastructure bill, which the Minister will be delighted I will be sitting opposite him for many months to come, unless the leader says otherwise, I hope that they will make that reform clearer. But my honourable and gallant friend would also know that many people have actually challenged whether the 1.5 million homes are achievable. Look, we as a party have always made clear that home ownership should be made a reality for many hard-working families, and we do generally support the 1.5 million new homes. However, I must stress an essential caveat, and that new homes must be the right homes and be delivered in the right places, as I've said to the Minister before. And development must be sensitive to local needs, sustainable in its approach, and guided by the voices of communities that it serves, including water services. And there is an important point in that rural communities where water supply concerns pose significant challenges, water demand in rural areas fluctuates due to climate change, tourism and agricultural needs. Despite this, the government's new housing targets failed to account for these systematic pressures, leading to a dramatic increase in required housing numbers, 106% in the New Forest, 199% in North Yorkshire, and a staggering 487% in Westmoreland and Furness. Rural voices must be heard, particularly in discussions on surrounding water infrastructure and the continued lack of a statutory footing for water companies. And to mitigate these challenges, early collaboration between strategic policy-making authorities and water companies is essential, and I know the Minister will agree, and we agree with him. The updated MPPF, for example, in December acknowledged this need, continuing the previous government's commitment to aligning water infrastructure with development. And while water companies are not statutory consultees, and we agree that they should be in the later stages of the planning process, good practice dictates that their involvement in the planning process should be encouraged from the outset. Simply put, we cannot afford to ignore the vital and critical role of sustainable water management in housing development. And that is why the last government implemented the Plan for Water, focused on reducing demand, halving leakage rates, developing new infrastructure and ensuring drought resilience. We set clear, legally binding targets, including a 20% reduction in public water supply usage by 2038 and a significant cut to leakage rates. Indeed, the previous government's record is clear. In 2010, only 7% of storm overflows were monitored. Under our leadership, we ensured 100% are now monitored. And we fast-tracked £180 million of investment to prevent over 8,000 sewage spills and secured £60 billion from water companies over the next 25 years. Yet, the Water Special Measures Bill does not adequately address the root causes of water pollution. Environmental groups like the River Action have criticised the bill, arguing that one-off actions will not resolve systematic pollution issues. And the truth is simple. The current system does not ensure that water demand and environmental protection are balanced. There's no real oversight, no accountability, and no urgency to fix the problem. And we also face a major problem, major disconnect between planning and water management. Water companies create water resource and management plans to project future demand, but these plans do not always account for the real-time pressures from new housing development. Similarly, drainage and wastewater management plans are meant to assess the wastewater capacity, yet they lack the detail needed to align with local planning. And what's worse, as has been outlined by the Honourable Lady and many Liberal Democrat colleagues, is that water companies are not statutory consultees in the late stage of the planning process when detailed applications go before local authorities. This means that local councils approve new developments without properly assessing whether there is enough water supply or sewage treatment capacity. Under the law, water companies are forced to connect new developments, even when they know they lack the resources to do so sustainably. And only the Secretary of State can make the changes to the statutory list through secondary legislation. During the passage of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act 2023, the government at the time committed to consulting on whether water companies should become statutory consultees on individual planning applications, and if so, how this could be facilitated. And I wonder if the Minister could outline, and he may not be able to tell us this afternoon, if he'd write to me and concerned parties, where we are on that review and whether that review evidence is still within his department. It may be that honourable members on this side of the House may have to put amendments forward in the forthcoming planning and infrastructure bill to see that these changes are necessary on water companies. We would call for the government to publish the review, as I've just mentioned, into the statutory consultee system and look to include water companies' views on supply and treatment capacity before local authorities grant planning permission. This will enable water companies to input effectively on the planning process and better align investment plans with local development needs. To conclude, Mrs. Lawbuck, the stakes are clear. We need a housing policy that's ambitious but also realistic. We need more water infrastructure that is sustainable and resilient. But most importantly, we need a government that listens to local communities rather than imposing those top-down unachievable targets and removing statutory consultees from the national planning policy framework and systems. I urge the government to build upon the solid foundation laid by its predecessors, as it expect me to say, to deliver on the plan for water and to ensure that home ownership remains within reach for hard-working families without compromising the integrity of our national resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Lawbuck. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. I begin by congratulating the Honourable Lady, the member for North Shropshire, on securing this important and informative debate and for not only so clearly articulating a number of legitimate concerns relating to the role of water companies in planning for new residential development, but for so eloquently outlining the plight of her constituents in the cases she mentioned. Can I also thank the other honourable members who've participated in the debate and who shared valuable insights and experiences from their own constituencies. I'd say, Mrs. Lawbuck, that I not only note and appreciate the various concerns that have been raised in relation to this issue, I also recognise the strength of feeling, I hope, in my remarks to come to convey both that the government have already acted in numerous respects, but also that we are alive to the need to do more to address the fact that the system clearly, in many parts of the country, is not delivering the outcomes that we want to see. Now, a number of distinct issues were raised in the course of the debate. I'll seek to address as many of them as possible in the time I have available. As ever, if I overlook any specific issues that honourable members have raised individually, I'd be more than happy to find time to discuss them outside of the chamber and to speak more widely to the group of honourable members here and others who've got concerns about this issue. Mrs. Lawbuck, I wanted to start with sustainable development, the principle of sustainable development, as set out in paragraph 7 of the National Planning Policy Framework. The purpose of the planning system is to contribute to the achievement of it, including the provision of homes, commercial development and supporting infrastructure in a sustainable manner. Planning policies and decisions should play an active role in guiding development towards sustainable solutions, and sustainable development should be pursued both through the preparation and implementation of local development plans and the application of policies in the framework. In short, Mrs. Lawbuck, the government are clear. Housing must come with appropriate development infrastructure, including appropriate water infrastructure. With regard specifically to sustainable drainage systems, an issue mentioned by a number of honourable members, including the mover of the debate, honourable members will know the revised MPPF we published on the 12th of December last year makes clear that developments of all sizes should use sustainable drainage techniques where the development could have drainage impacts and should have appropriate maintenance arrangements in place. These are important changes to the MPPF, which will mean that sustainable drainage technologies are taken up more widely in new development. We are continuing to explore whether more needs to be done, whether through planning policy or by commencing Schedule 3 to the Water and Flood Management Act 2010, and a decision on the best way forward will be made in the coming months. On a related matter, Mrs. Lawbuck, I appreciate that there are some instances of existing sewers not being able to adequately cope with new developments, and we've heard a number of pretty troubling examples here this afternoon. To avoid this issue, the planning practice guidance sets out that good design and mitigation measures should be secured during development, both through site-specific and non-site-specific policies on water infrastructure. For example, using planning conditions and obligations to ensure that development is phased and not occupied until the necessary waterworks have been completed. I'd be very interested to hear from honourable members who've mentioned the fact that some local authorities are not using those conditions and obligations, why that might be the case. However, I will give further thoughts to the issue in light of the various examples that have been referenced today. Mrs Lawbuck, reference was rightly made by the member for North Shropshire and other honourable members to the role of local plans in delivering sustainable development. Planning is principally a local activity, and this government is clear that the plan-led approach is and must remain the cornerstone of the planning system. We are determined to progress towards universal local plan coverage, and as the Deputy Prime Minister and I have repeatedly made clear, we will not hesitate to use the full range of ministerial intervention powers at our disposal to that end. A key function of local development plans is to guide development to the most suitable and sustainable locations and to ensure associated infrastructure requirements are addressed. As honourable members are aware, water companies are under a statutory duty to provide new water and sewage connections to residential properties, as well as plan to meet the needs of growth as part of water resource management plans and drainage and wastewater management plans. The Water Resources Planning Guideline published by the government sets out how those companies should forecast future demand for water based on existing customers and planned levels of household and non-household growth, with a number of planned developments being based on published local plans. But I do note the comments made by the Shadow Minister as how the operation of that system might be improved. Effective cooperation early in the plan-making process is essential to ensuring not only that housing and infrastructure need is appropriately planned for, but that they are aligned with each other. And the National Planning Policy Framework makes clear that local planning authorities should collaborate with each other and with other public bodies, including infrastructure providers, to identify relevant strategic matters to be addressed, including providing for sustainable water supplies. But I have heard and noted the concerns made by honourable members that despite the government's very clear expectations in this regard, such collaboration is not always evident, and I'll reflect on the implications of this for national planning policy. Turning next to the statutory consultee system, Mrs Lawbuck, we are very clear that it is not operating effectively. We've been told as much not only by house builders but by local planning authorities from across the country. Honourable members will be aware that the Chancellor and the Deputy Prime Minister have imposed a moratorium on new statutory consultees, and I also draw the House's attention to the written statement I made on Monday, setting out how the government intends to reform the statutory consultee system to ensure it is operating effectively, including consulting on limiting the scope of StatCons to where advice is strictly necessary and removing entirely a limited number of them. And I have heard the calls made today, organised calls, I might imply, from the Lib Dem benches opposite, to add water companies to the list of statutory consultees. What I would gently say to honourable members is I do not think this is the panacea that they imply it is. Indeed, I think that doing so would risk allowing water companies to argue against the delivery of new homes rather than focusing on their responsibility to ensure the appropriate infrastructure is in place at the outset. And that is why it's important, Mrs Allbutt, that while water companies are not statutory consultees on individual planning applications, statute requires that they are consulted in the preparation of local plans, and that's because strategic issues, such as water capacity, are best dealt with at a strategic level through the plan-making process rather than through individual planning applications. Ensuring we're taking a strategic spatial planning approach to the management of water, including tackling pollution and managing pressures on the water environment at a catchment, regional and national scale, is a core objective of the ongoing independent review into the regulatory system of the water sector launched in October 2024 by the UK and Welsh governments. And as I hope honourable members are aware, the Commission is expected to report by the second quarter of next year, and I know honourable members will engage with it. The government is acutely aware that the sustainable supply of water in some areas, for example Cambridge and North Sussex, is an immediate constraint on growth, and we're tackling this issue in various ways. For example, in these instances, we work closely with local authorities, regulators and water companies to find creative solutions to unlock growth and address environmental pressures. Our work in Cambridge, for example, to address water scarcity has already helped to unlock applications for over 9,000 homes and 500,000 square metres of commercial space. And similar initiatives are possible in other areas. The Honourable Member for North Shropshire and a few other Honourable Members drew our attention specifically to Section 104 agreements outlined in the Water Industry Act 1991. Developers and water companies can enter into these voluntary agreements which, where they work, do ensure that newly constructed sewers firstly are built to an appropriate standard and secondly become the responsibility of the local water company for maintenance once they are operational. But I have heard and I note the critiques that have been made, and if honourable members will indulge me by putting to me in writing some of the cases that have been specified this afternoon, I'd like to look into the matter further to see if the system needs improvement in various ways. As I have the time available to me, Mrs Lord-Buck, I'll just speak very briefly about two other issues. Firstly, the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Alongside targeted local interventions, the Government is taking steps to ensure we can more quickly and effectively upgrade major economic infrastructure across the whole country, including water supplies. In last year's budget, the Government confirmed its commitment to delivering a new 10-year infrastructure strategy, providing more certainty and stability for the supply chain and helping to unlock private investment by setting out the Government's vision, objectives and priorities for infrastructure over the next decade. Additionally, honourable members will know that yesterday we introduced our flagship Planning and Infrastructure Bill. One of the Bill's 5 overarching objectives is to deliver a faster and more certain consenting process for critical infrastructure, including vital water infrastructure, through streamlining NSIP consultation requirements, ensuring national policy statements are kept up to date. Honourable members will know that some of them date back to 2012, and reducing opportunities for judicial review. And I encourage and indeed welcome the engagement of new honourable members from across the House as that legislation progresses. I will give way.
Thank you, Chair. Just hearing the points that the Minister's made, can he just confirm that his department are not going to make water companies statutory consultees during the planning process?
Couldn't have been clearer than what the statement I made, that the Chancellor and the Deputy Prime Minister have imposed a moratorium on new statutory consultees. We don't think the system is operating effectively. As I said, local authorities and house builders are telling us as much. But water companies are, as I said, do have a statutory role in the local plan consultation process, and on any application they can provide their view. Not being a statutory consultee doesn't prevent them from doing so on any application that is submitted. I wanted just to make some brief comments on water quality and pollution, Mrs Lord-Buck. On top of the actual provisions of water infrastructure, that we are also facing challenges in maintaining the quality of our water due to ever-increasing pressures from pollution, climate change and unsustainable practice. This Government is prioritising water quality as a key element of our environmental and public health agenda. Significant steps are being taken to address pollution, enhance infrastructure and ensure clean and sustainable water sources for future generations. For example, as part of our efforts to create a plan-led system that is underpinned by a genuinely accessible and understandable policy framework, we intend to consult on and produce a set of national policies for decision-making later this year. This will include policies on topics such as pollution, plan-making, healthy and safe communities, and the delivery of homes, and how all of this interlinks, and further details will be announced in due course. The Government is also working with farmers to reduce agricultural pollution. The Environment Act 2021, introduced by the previous Government, set a legally binding target to reduce nitrogen, phosphorus and sediment contribution from agriculture by at least 40% by 2038. And this is why, alongside developing a new statutory plan to restore nature and meet these targets, we are enforcing key regulations such as the farming rules for water and have carried out thousands of inspections through the Environment Agency. So in closing, Mrs Lord-Buck, I want to underline that the Government expects sustainable development to be pursued both through the effective preparation and implementation of local plans and the application of relevant national planning policy. As a Government, we have already taken and will continue to take steps to ensure that new housing developments have adequate water and wastewater infrastructure as a matter of course. I've heard the concerns, as I've said, of the Honourable Member for North Shropshire and other Honourable Members as to what more may be required to ensure that is the case, and I can assure all those who participated in the debate this afternoon that the concerns they've raised will be at the forefront of my mind as we continue to progress our planning reform agenda.
Helen Morgan to wind up.
Mrs Lord-Buck, and can I thank everyone who contributed in that debate. It was really good to see cross-party agreement on some of the issues that our residents are facing in terms of lack of capacity in the local drainage systems when houses are built, and lack of appropriate planning conditions being imposed in some of those very localised incidents. Can I also thank the Shadow Minister and the Lib Dem spokesperson for their thoughtful contributions as well. They were all excellent, and particularly can I thank the Minister for not ruling out the adoption of Schedule 3 to the Water Management Act. I do understand his point about water companies and statutory consultees and the risk that that poses to getting planning applications through the process. But I would ask him to consider the fact that the local planning system doesn't work either. There are many, many councils without a local plan in place. They don't have the planning officers in place and can't afford to put them in place in order to develop good local plans. And we do need to find a way to address that problem. And finally, on the issue of Section 104 agreements, I will write to the Minister on the specific issues that I've had. I would be very grateful for a meeting with him to go through them in detail. Thank you very much.
The question is that this House has considered the role of water companies in new housing development planning. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order. Order.